Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it's not a bad audience, size-wise, given the time of the semester, so I much appreciate everybody coming. This is the 8th essay that I've read for the Fine Arts Festival, and they're all on the same subject, which is wild orchids. And I really want to thank the Fine Arts Festival for having this event, because it's a great opportunity to read, to test out your pieces that you're working on, and to get some feedback possibly from your project. So I really appreciate that, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing at the beginning of this and creative nonfiction, and then read you part of the essay, and then I'm going to summarize the ending. Hi, Mary Ellen. Come on in. So, as I said, I've been working on the subject of wild orchids for about 8 years, ever since the Fine Arts Festival started. And it wasn't until the 6th year that I realized, after someone pointing it out to me, that what I was really doing was writing a memoir. And it's true. I thought that my subject was wild orchids, but in many ways, my real subject is my parents and how our parents pass on to us our interests, our traits, and many other things. And so it's been interesting to realize that and to start to make some adaptations to that, to the essays that I've done before. I really realized that this was a memoir. One of the things about nonfiction that's pretty fascinating is that your subject is not only yourself but the world, and the world keeps wanting to creep into the essay. So your job as a nonfiction writer is try to put some brakes on that. Try to put some boundaries on the world creeping into your essay. So it requires a certain amount of discipline, and that means it requires a certain number of drafts. So I have been doing too many drafts lately of this essay because I had to redirect it from where I thought I was going to the focus that it has now. So I just discovered the inner story to the essay a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to be reading a little bit from the essay. I think the only other thing that I might want to tell you is that I'm standing in front of a piece of art about photography. I don't know if you can tell from here, but it has a slide carousel, which is certainly kind of gone obsolete now that we have digital photography, and a lamp for lighting on the subject, and an old camera case, which is very appropriate because photography is one of the lenses into this essay that I'll be reading. And then also the essay meditates, as you know if you've seen the title of it, on beauty. And I read a previous essay about beauty in which I discovered that beauty was known as the B word in photography. You're not allowed to mention it, which surprised me to no end at that time because I was a new photographer and I was using the word. So it's about photography and beauty and my parents. The small yellow lady slipper and this business about beauty. I have an epigraph to the essay from Plotinus, a Greek philosopher from the 3rd century AD. This is the spirit that beauty must ever indulge. Wonderment and a delicious trouble, longing and love, and a trembling that is all delight. Living as my family did on what locals dubbed the Orchid Highway, It was probably not surprising that my parents were both passionate about floral beauty. The specific objects of their taste, however, could not have been more different. My mother worshipped wildflowers, especially lady slippers, while my father was infatuated with the engineered marvels offered up for sale by modern horticulture. My parents' relationships with the plants they favored also differed. Looking back, it strikes me that Mom's connection to wildflowers was about communion, while Dad's relationship to his hybrids was about control. Dad paid tribute to the beauty of his hybrids through his other major hobby, photography. While he occasionally took black and white shots of his 3 daughters and developed them in his basement darkroom, flowers were far and away his preferred subject. He sought out the largest, brightest, blowsiest specimens he could find and photographed them in color, even though that meant he could not develop them himself. Back when his annual income was still in the 4 digits and color film was expensive to buy and to process, his steel and glass flower slides numbered in the thousands. When one of his dinner plate dahlias grew particularly large, Dad would document its size by positioning the unwilling head of his nearest daughter beside the lush, pointy-petaled bloom and snap the shutter. Dahlias, lilies, and hybrid roses were his favorite models, but sometimes he could be talked into photographing my mother's wild favorites too, the showy lady slipper and the yellow lady slipper. In the 50s and 60s, white, yellow, pink, and pink and white slipper orchids were estimated at 5 to 10 million along an 80-mile stretch of Highway 11, the northernmost east-west highway in the state. Despite the continual depredation of seasonal road work, the DNR estimates today's orchid population on this stretch of road at more than 2 million, the bulk of which are lady slippers. Abundant as they were back then, slipper orchids were notoriously difficult to capture on film. Macro shots were my father's specialty. He loved to zoom in on one bloom at a time. With lady slippers, this meant that some flower parts were inevitably out of focus. Today, a photographer with a digital camera can solve this problem in Photoshop by combining multiple captures into one focused shot. But back in the 50s and 60s, when my father was kneeling in the ditches, photographing yellow lady slippers at my mother's behest, he was forced to forgo his usual flower aesthetic, which was uniform focus throughout the frame. Due to the distance between the long jutting lip of the slipper and the dangling corkscrew lateral petals framing that lip, it was impossible to capture both features in a macro shot. If the pouch of a yellow lady slipper was in focus, the crimson-stained center of the flower and its claret-colored lateral sepals were not, and vice versa. And that wasn't the only difficulty the yellow lady slipper presented. Direct sunlight leached out the rich golden color of the pouch, leaving white spots at its apex. Add the slightest bit of wind, and the burgundy sepals and golden slipper would both dance out of focus. With his hybrid subjects, my father avoided these problems by cutting them and taking them inside to photograph under controlled conditions. But that wasn't a viable option for lady slippers. I'm a recent convert to photography who shoots in digital but prefers not to use Photoshop or resort to multiple captures, so I share the same difficulties Dad experienced when out in the field. So do the film-based professional nature photographers who shot orchids for the 2012 edition of the DNR Orchid Guide, Native Orchids of Minnesota. Despite the continual improvements in lenses and in-camera development techniques, the guide's photos of the small yellow lady slipper lack focus, and the orchid's golden pouch is overexposed, washed out. If Dad were alive, he might have taken comfort from this failure. But then again, maybe not. He wanted that shot. Although he started out with a Voigtlander brilliant folding camera with a good German lens, he later switched to Nikon's, the same camera brand that I use now. He fancied himself a man of science, and unlike my technophobic self, would have taken advantage of any new feature that improved his technique. As a child, I wondered what my father could be thinking. Summer after summer, I watched him take hundreds, perhaps thousands of shots of the same tea orchids, tea roses. Now I finally understand it, since I do the same thing. I'd be embarrassed to admit the number of photos I've taken over the last 5 years of 2 small yellow lady slippers that I nickname the Bandits. I realize now that Dad was seeking to do no less than capture the essence of beauty on film, and he was always inevitably falling short of that goal, as I am too. Back when Dad was photographing cut flowers in his basement studio or bending down in ditches to capture a lady slipper's grace, he would have had no inkling that beauty has long been the unmentionable word in photographic, philosophic, and artistic circles. Nor did I until recently, and I would venture to guess, nor did most of you. The online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy summarizes a continuous line of philosophical musings on the nature of beauty that stretches from Plato in the 4th century BC through the 19th century. That continuity was broken with the start of the modernist period, when beauty went into an abrupt decline as the subject of aesthetics and as an artistic goal. Instead, it became de rigueur to depict materialist, utilitarian scenes and objects, read ugly here, as being more true to the tenor of the century than such pre-industrial romantic subjects as the order and beauty of the natural world, or for that matter, the order and beauty of the middle-class domestic hearth. In his critique of the century that turned away from beauty, French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu contends that both the class background we're born into and our class aspirations determine our cultural taste. He argues that the eye of the beholder is far from subjective, but is rather a product of history determined by education, a byproduct, in other words, of one's class. Bourdieu concludes that perhaps unconsciously we seek to gain status and privilege by means of our cultural knowledge and by the quality and taste we exhibit in our material acquisitions. Grasping the full implication of that notion is unsettling, to say the least. I was a PhD candidate when I first read Bourdieu's Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. For months after reading it, I went around guessing the motives behind what I bought, what I loved, what I wore, what I read, and what I said. I could not seem to stop looking for signs and symptoms of pretension and snobbery in myself, a la Bourdieu. Lately, I've been thinking about Bourdieu again in connection with orchids. I've been wondering why my mother preferred the showy lady slipper to the equally lovely yellow lady slipper. Was she influenced by the showy's cachet as our official state flower? Was my mother an unconscious snob? Since I too favor orchids, which have long been considered symbols of wealth and status, was I a class-conscious, if unconscious, snob as well? The Stanford essay calls the nature of beauty one of the most controversial themes in Western philosophy. The main controversy revolves around whether beauty is subjective, or objective? Is it merely a matter of personal taste? Or is beauty a quality found within the object itself? Or is it a little of both? Think about it for a minute. What is your favorite flower? Did your grandmother grow it? Were you given that flower for the senior prom? Is it the color of the flower that you love? Do you associate it with a particular time and place when you were young and carefree? Or do you judge it on more formal criteria? Associations, color, form, proportion, contrast, size, shape, relative rarity, smell, and texture all could be reasons why we consider one flower more beautiful than another. And Purdue would add to that list the flower's status in the horticultural hierarchy. George Santayana was apparently the last serious philosopher to weigh in on the age-old debate about the nature of beauty. In 1896, just before we entered the aesthetic dark ages of the 20th century, Santayana published The Sense of Beauty. In it, he claims that beauty is irrational. He defines it as an emotional element, an affection brought about by our appreciative nature, a response to pleasure rather than utility. Exactly a century later, in 1996, the landscape photographer Robert Adams dared to use the B word in the title of his book. Beauty in Photography in Defense of Traditional Values argues that the 20th century's phobia about the use of the word beauty has come from the massive environmental damage that we've done to our country and to our world. He writes, "What bothers us about primordial beauty is that it is no longer characteristic. Unspoiled places sadden us because they are no longer true." Thomas Gray's consolation, "Many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air," has become an irony. We have the flowers fenced and counted. My father approved of both fencing and counting. His idea of beauty did not depend on wild, unspoiled places, as my mother's did. In fact, I suspect he believed that wildflowers were vastly inferior to the improved color, size, and scent that plant hybridizers could create in a laboratory setting. My mother signed on to Thoreau's view. He argued that we all long for the mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be indefinitely wild, unsurveyed and unfathomed by us. We can never have enough of nature, he said. My mother just wanted to enjoy nature and never joined my father in his digging, cultivating, fertilizing, spraying, and weeding rituals in the garden. Although she did have personal favorites, she would have appreciated this quote by Edward Abbey. "For myself, I hold no preferences among flowers as long as they are wild, free, spontaneous, bricks to all greenhouses, black thumb and cutworm to the potted plant." Prior to the 20th century, philosophers had been arguing about the nature of beauty for close to 2,500 years. Despite the abrupt break in that interest during the last century, the 2008 Stanford Essay on Beauty claims that there's been a reawakening of interest in it, both art and philosophy. My dead parents would have been delighted to hear this, and so am I. As testimony to the 21st century's slow return to beauty, the B word is beginning to crop up in public discourse more frequently now. Toni Morrison has said, "In some point in life, the world's beauty becomes enough." SMSU's provost, Beth Weatherby, dared to use the word in her inspiring poem delivered at the inauguration of our new president. A few weeks ago, on Krista Tippett's NPR radio show On Being, astrophysicist Jana Levine was interviewed. In response to a question, she said, and I quote, "I hesitate to use the word beauty on the air," but then went on to reference the word at least a half dozen more times when discussing the laws of nature. Levine told Tippett that while philosophers, artists, and writers had not been allowed to use the word beauty in the 20th century, mathematicians and scientists have been granted disposition to do so when talking about their respective disciplines. In his book, Defense of Beauty, Adams confesses, "For many years I found it embarrassing to use the word beauty, even while believing in it." His book was his coming out party. In it, he reiterates the once widely accepted but now daring proposition that the proper goal of art is beauty. Maybe Bordeaux has made me a little defensive about my tastes here, but I like to think that I love orchids not because they're expensive to import or serve as some kind of class symbol, but because they're inherently more interesting, unusual, strange, and yes, more beautiful than any other family of flowers. Here's how the 17th century German botanist Brenius describes these fascinating creatures. "If nature ever showed her playfulness in the formation of plants, this is visible in the most striking way among orchids. They take on the form of little birds, of lizards, of insects. They look like a man, like a woman, sometimes like an austere, sinister fighter, sometimes like a clown who excites our laughter. They represent the image of a lazy tortoise, a melancholy toad, an agile, ever-chattering monkey. Nature has formed orchids in such a way that unless they make us laugh, they surely excite our greatest imagination." Darwin was an avid student of just this aspect of orchids. He studied them not because they were beautiful to look at or because they caused him to feel pleasure or affection or because orchids had become a Victorian craze that only the wealthy class could afford. No, like scientist Jana Levine, he was a scientist through and through. In a letter to a colleague, he posed the rhetorical question, who could fancy anything more perfect than orchids and their curious contrivances? In another letter, he said of the orchid family, "The beauty of the adaptation of parts seems to be unparalleled." Darwin was the first to describe the adaptive contrivances by which the yellow lady slipper attracts its pollinator, despite the fact that its flower pouch contains no nectar. The orchid has evolved to compensate for that lack by attracting potential pollinators in other ways. The bee slides into the pouch-like slipper, attracted by the bright yellow and scarlet markings inside, and by the orchid's spicy sweet scent. Finding no nectar and unable to exit the pouch by way of the front entrance, the bee climbs a ladder of hairs that lead it to the two rear exits, where it picks up a dusting of male pollen. On the way into the next yellow lady slipper, the bee deposits its payload of pollen on the female portion of the flower. Ingenious, and beautiful too. One recent wildflower guide summarizes the pollination process of the yellow lady slipper this way. The lady slipper's flower is like a funhouse tunnel for bees, with a one-way entrance, then a big chamber with a bright exit sign and some sticky sweet hairs on the way. One of the burning questions about Minnesota's small yellow lady slippers is how they've escaped the fate of their British relatives. Down to a sole specimen, Under 24/7 armed guard in the north of England, the yellow lady slipper is now functionally extinct. Like the lone ivory-billed woodpecker that supposedly still lurks in an Arkansas cypress swamp. With no other orchid on the island to transfer its pollen to, the last yellow lady slipper in England's clever funhouse adaptation developed over eons is all for naught. In this country, the small yellow lady slipper has seen its threats too. It was extensively harvested for medicinal purposes during the last century. The drug manufactured from its roots was called cipredin, which was thought to cure neuralgia and depression. Think Valium substitute here. Due to the once widespread commercial use of the yellow lady slipper and its false reputation for being easy to transplant, its numbers are declining or endangered in most U.S. states, with the exception of Minnesota, where we still have sizable populations in our vast northern peat bogs. For my mother's sake, I love the showy lady slipper, but I have to confess that it's not my personal favorite. No, to quote Plotinus, I've reserved the better part of my wonderment, longing, and love for the small yellow lady slipper. My favorite orchid hobbyists, Morris and Eames, express a similar preference in their 1929 book, Our Wild Orchids. Of the small yellow lady slipper, they write, "Common as it is, we can hardly help being thrilled by its wonderful grace and beauty, as fresh as the dawn of creation. Were it as rare as its British relative, we should not hesitate to proclaim it one of the most beautiful of flowers and the queen of the lady slippers." I'm going to quit there because I wanted to keep this to a half hour, but where I go from there in the essay is I start to look a little bit more at photography again, and I begin to realize that while my whole life I've been telling myself I'm exactly like my mother in her interests, I'm an awful lot like my father too, and I'm very interested in all of the latest procedures that are developing hybrid orchids, which is protecting the wild orchids since people buy those instead. And so I end by tracing the ways in which I have to admit, after having done this essay, that Dad's in there too, influencing me. New realization for me as I worked on the essay. And then I end the essay with an image of my Olympus 50-50 camera, which I lost in the bog and never found again. So I end with that image of basically the machine in the garden, my camera somewhere in the bog being decorated with sphagnum moss and cranberry vines still sitting there. And maybe some anthropologist will or archaeologist will dig it up in the 22nd century and wonder, what is this? Or hopefully there'll still be photographers say, oh, how archaic. Anyway, thanks so much for coming, and I hope everybody takes advantage of being in the room to take a look at the senior art show as well. It's really interesting.